Hi, Ed.
Steven, how are you?
Not too bad. I'm happy to put myself on the camera. If you can see me, I won't be able to really pay attention to the camera though until I get home. If that's
Okay.
okay with you.
No, that's fine. So in your message, you said you could talk until you got home. So, or are you gonna continue to talk once
I
you
can
get home?
absolutely continue to talk. We can. I figure we can go ahead and kick off the discussion. Talk about whatever we want to talk about, and then I'll actually be able to physically engage and actually look you in the eye after I get home. But this should at least buy us a little more time to talk.
Okay. Why don't we start? If you could kind of give me a little bit of your background. I'm going to see if I can. And I've got another guy who wants to join the conversation, and I'm not sure I can figure out how to do that. I always have trouble with this part. Let's close this out. So if what's your background?
Well, what do you want to know? Geographically?
Well, no, just kind of like your worldview background. Were you raised religious, not religious? What you
Okay,
know?
yeah, I was raised in a Southern Baptist home. I think with the sole exception, I think we went to a Methodist church when I was in the third grade. But other than that, it was Southern Baptist through and through. From that went on, I followed that. I think that I would consider myself to be a Southern Baptist all the way up until I was in the Marines. Actually, through until after I was in the Marines, and that's when the transition started. Well, maybe not started, but that's when it really happened. Was after I was out of the Marines. I was in college in Texas, and a little bit of the quick backstory. I'll try to make it relatively quick. Is I failed biology when I was a freshman in college before I joined the Marines, and probably the chief reason why I failed biology is because I out and outright rejected evolution. Um, and the professor was very in your face about it. He even called us out. He even asked, "Are there any creationists in here?" And I rose my hand. My hand went up. My hand shot up, and he was adamant that he was going to basically shut us down and prove us wrong. And I took that as a very combative thing, and I took a hard nosed stance, and I basically refused to listen, and it cost me back then because I didn't really pay attention to the material. I ended up dropping out of the class. Um, then I went to school in Texas, and I decided to retake biology because when I dropped out of the class, I dropped it too late, and I ended up with an F on my transcript, which really irritated me. So I decided to retake biology to replace that F. And I said, you don't have to believe what they say, just learn the material. Learn the material enough to take the test, to pass the test. And um, in doing so, I started paying attention and I started learning about it. And I realized that one of the things that convinced me to just go ahead and listen and actually pay attention was this idea that, hey, if I have true faith and the evidence, and if what I have faith in, which is at the time God, if what I have faith in is God, and if God is real, then the evidence, I don't have to worry about the evidence. I don't have to worry about the text. I don't have to worry about the entire body of evidence. It's all going to point towards the existence of God. And so I started paying attention. I said, what am I worried about? It's not faith. So I paid attention and I started to learn and I started to understand, you know, how evolution worked and why it worked, and I started to realize that the contradictions were starting to pile up on the creationist side. And when I started paying attention to that, I asked myself, well, if God is real, and if the version of God and the version of earth is real that creation has put forth, then why is it that these creationists have to make up these stories? Why do they have to lie about biology in order to make it fit their worldview? And that's really when it really started to crumble down. I had questions before that, but that really started to make it crumble. And that's kind of where I am now. I'm still fascinated with religion. Hold on a second. There is the Dodgers are in the playoffs, and I am having to deal with that traffic right now. I live near the stadium. Anyway, that's kind of the background for me. I still am really engaged. I still love the topic of religion. I am fascinated about it, fascinated with it. But yeah, that's really kind of my background.
So you were raised in a Southern Baptist church and encountered some biology, and now you've embraced evolution.
It was through the ACE, the Accelerated Christian Education. I went to an ACE school. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay. Yeah, it's a school curriculum.
And so this convinced you. So what was it specifically that evolutionary theory in your mind contradicted? Or not evolutionary theory, biology.
What it contradicted from what I was hearing from like creationists?
Yeah, contrary to what you'd been taught as a Christian.
I think the one that stands out to me is the Bombardier Beetle. It was about the Bombardier Beetle and ACE curriculum, the Christian education curriculum that I was taking. Talked about the Bombardier Beetle and gave reasons, its version of reasons why it was, what is the term? It was not infinitely. What's that term for? They compare it. They like to compare it to like a mousetrap where.
Irreducible complexity.
Yes, irreducible complexity. That's the term, and it was always that angle. It was always in that particular when I started to learn about when I first
You're breaking up on me. I can't hear you, and I lost your visual. Can you hear me? Let's see if we can get Steve back in. I wonder if he can just dial back in or if I have to throw in the link. Let me go over here. Are you back?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I couldn't hear you. I lost you for a good minute.
Okay, yeah, it might have been because of where I was. I'm not sure. Sometimes because of the hills around here, the service can be kind of spotty.
Okay.
So yeah, that was one thing, and I think some of the other stuff was the general age of the Earth idea, and it being only 6,000 years old, and let's see, it's like some of the stuff that I still see. Um, you pull up like answers in Genesis, and you'll look at, and they have like their grove theory or their orchard theory, or hypothesis, I guess you would really create it, and I'm like, or call it, and I'm like, I mean, they'll sit here and acknowledge adaptation and just refuse to admit that that is actual evolution. And even though their little orchard theory, like if you take one of those trees, just one of them, it's pretty much exactly what the evolutionary tree or evolutionary biologist suggests. It's just farther on down the line. And yeah, stuff like that, just little things like that.
Okay. So what is your current view of reality? Are you a naturalist or a materialist?
I guess you could say that. What what I what I believe is that everything that we see, everything that is around us, is physical. So, does that necessarily mean it's natural? Um, I don't know, but everything that we see and know is physical, and everything that we can evaluate is physical in some sense. Everything we can detect is physical in some sense. And when you get down to discussions on the soul, or when you get down to discussions on the spirit, it's really, when you start getting into the kind of the details of it, it's really it seems indistinguishable from the mind itself. And the mind, so far as I know, is a physical entity. So yeah, I
The
guess you could say
brain.
that I'm more or less a naturalist.
So that would make you a determinist.
And I'm not familiar with all the terms. If you could kind of give me a brief definition of what that means, I can kind of confirm or deny that.
Well, okay. So a determinist would hold that they're really not free to kind of that the mind and the brain, I guess, being one and the same thing. That I am determined by nature. My brain is determined by nature, hardwired by nature, to do the things it does, to believe the things it believes, to function the way that it functions. And this idea that human beings are actually, let's just say, have a say in freely behaving the way they behave is really just a myth. That it's not compatible with naturalism. So that would mean that you would be a determinist, because human beings just are their brains, right?
Uh, Maybe. I've thought about that. I think it seems, at least on a surface, relatively plausible.
Does
That that when you come down to it, our choices, so to speak, are simply a result of physics. My desire to take a right-hand turn just happens to be because the molecules in my brain lined up in that particular order at that particular time, and this particular vehicle is in this particular location at this particular time. My brain lined up in that particular order at that particular time.
Weird
Particular
feedback.
vehicle
Jeff.
is in this particular location at this particular time.
My brain
lined up. I don't know if you can mute yourself for just a second, Jeff. I kind of I think it's an interesting idea. I don't know if that's what I believe, and I think that's I think that's kind of the linchpin under which my entire philosophy lies. Is in the end, I don't know for sure. I think that's an interesting idea, though. I don't know if I'd call myself a determinist, but it's an interesting idea.
So then, if you go down this path of naturalism, materialism, and human beings just are their brains. First of all, I would dispute the fact that it's plausible. I would say that everything about human experience flies against the idea that we're just a machine. There is nothing about human experience that in this life that really comports with existentially this notion that we're just our brain and that we're really not free. And we don't act like that either. We don't conduct ourselves in that way. We talk about free will. We talk about responsibility. We talk about heroes. We talk about villains. We talk about morality. We talk about sacrifice. We talk about all of these things. And to be quite frank, Steve, none of those things make any sense whatsoever if naturalism is true, right? Because what a hero, the entire concept of a hero is emptied of its content. It's meaningless. It's in that system, a hero is exactly the same in terms of valuing someone's behavior as a villain. Because they're both just brains doing what nature has hardwired their brains to do.
Sure, and I would respond like this, and I would actually kind of agree with you. Not necessarily that not plausible. I think it's perfectly plausible. I think it's just kind of a thing of reframing. And please don't mistake this for me telling you that this is what I believe. I don't know. Again, I don't know.
Sure.
This is just for the sake of discussion, and I'm going to go ahead and play the role of devil's advocate, I guess, here, and say that, yeah, you're probably right. If that is true, then you're absolutely right that a hero becomes indistinguishable from a villain. And then I would go ahead and I would argue a little bit further that maybe a hero and a villain is not necessarily required to be a result of free will, but maybe instead it's just the machine of physics classifying and identifying a specific configuration of the world as we see around it. We see a specific configuration. It has specific qualities. It has things that we can identify in some way as fitting into a specific mode. And that mode is something that we identify as being a villain or being a hero. In fact, I think that this is not necessarily a concept that is really that foreign to us at all. Because even if we go with the idea that we are, truly sentient beings with free will, which I think that I would be more inclined to believe, but I think that's something that we still do. I think that if you went over to the USSR back in 1970s, I think that I would be more inclined. I think that you could make a same kind of argument that the families over there would like to portray a lot of those their individuals as heroes and portraying and conversely portraying many Americans as villains. And we do the same thing. And it's because not necessarily that there's a hard and fast um, rule or baseline or objective definition of a hero or villain, but it's because it fits into a specific category that we recognize. That would be my argument. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, no, I kind of understand what you're saying. I'm going to give Jeff. I think Jeff tried to say something a couple of times, so I'm going to give Jeff a chance to jump in and see if he wants to say anything.
Yeah, go for
it. Michaels. Jeff, I can't hear you. I can see you, can't hear you. Well, I can see your picture, can't hear you. Let's see. Send me a message over here. How do I get to it? Oh, he doesn't have a microphone, so he can't talk. All right, so we'll continue.
How did we hear him?
We'll continue on. I can see him.
I thought
well, you're right. I did hear something there. So I don't know, Jeff. We did hear you at one point.
And I was hearing my voice come from his name, so I think that was my feedback coming from his speakers into his microphone. So,
yeah. So I think, when I think about this framework, one of the things that is to me really puzzling about this line of thinking is why it is that the cognitive faculties of the overwhelming majority of people on the planet actually are not aligned to this kind of thinking. If indeed this is just nature doing what nature does. In other words, nature has essentially, what you're saying is that nature has wired most cognitive faculties to get it wrong.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying it's an interesting hypothesis.
Right, but if you look at that hypothesis and you examine it and you say, okay, let's pretend that this is the way things are, then why is it that the cognitive faculties across the globe are so freaking screwed up? Because the number of people, the number of human beings on the planet who are actually true naturalists or materialists is infinitesimally small. Why would that be if their theory or their hypothesis was actually true? It shouldn't be that way. I mean, why would there be so many crazy ideas about how things work if nature is hardwiring the brains to begin with? It seems to me that I mean, and second, Steve, we would never. How would you ever know? You would never know. Jeff, I heard you. You came through on something. You just spoke. Are you there? Is that making sense? Steve, do you want to be called Steve or Steven? My son, my second oldest son's name's Steven. He prefers Steven.
Yeah, I prefer Steven as well. My dad's name was Steven. Okay. He went by Steve. I went by Steven. So, yeah, I'm good with Steven.
Okay.
I think that there are a lot of ideas that ended up being true that were not subscribed to at some point by the vast majority of people. I don't think that believing something, I don't think that anything is true or false based on the number of people who believe in it.
Oh no, I'm not saying that.
If something is true and most people don't believe in it, there could be lots of reasons for that. To answer the question of why is that the case, there could be a lot of reasons for that. I would say one case is that maybe people just haven't thought of it yet, or maybe people haven't been part of this kind of discussion yet and really dug down and to think about it.
Yeah, I agree with with what you said about the majority doesn't decide, the majority in embracing a belief, it doesn't necessarily mean the belief is true. But on the other hand, I do think that there are some philosophies that if they are true, then what we see, actually the state of affairs that we see obtain, shouldn't actually be the case. And so, in other words, there are some positions that if they do obtain, such as this one, then it would be a potential defeater for this particular philosophy. And I think that it's quite possible that that would be one. So here's the other question, Stephen, that I think naturalism or materialism actually introduces, and this is really introduced and expanded upon a great deal in the work of Alvin Plantinga in his case against evolutionary theory from naturalism. And the argument has to do with the fact that if naturalism is true, we have a very serious problem with the reliability of the cognitive faculties to deliver truth. Because when we start talking about what is true, what is not true, we for sure have to take into consideration the cognitive faculties. And once we do that, we have to start to acknowledge that some people's cognitive faculties are just not functioning properly. They're not reliable. I mean, there are people in straitjackets. We've got, people are institutionalized, or crazy people in the world. Accidents happen to folks, and so there are a number of people whose cognitive faculties are not functioning properly. But here's the thing: if naturalism is true and evolutionary theory is true, what criteria? How could you ever come up with a set of criteria by which you could measure what is actually properly functioning cognitive faculties without relying on those very faculties to come up with the criteria? You are stuck in a vicious circle here in terms of true belief forming processes, I think. So, I mean, and when I think about this, that's where my mind goes. It's not just the freedom issue; it's also the reliability of the cognitive faculties, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a fair question. However, I think there's a relatively simple answer to it. I think the answer is twofold. I think that the answer to that is summed up by what I was telling you about myself earlier, just a few minutes ago, is that I don't know. I don't, in the end, there are a lot of things. In fact, I would say most things I don't know. And the way that relates is that in order to, basically I'll tell you exactly what I'm trying to say is that the circle never closes. If you're going to talk about a circular argument, you have to have a circle, meaning that it has to close. And I don't think that with respect to our cognitive abilities, our circle ever closes. And I think that we demonstrate that on a daily basis. When you cross the street, we can sit here before you cross the street. You can sit here and you can evaluate the situation. You can say, okay, all the cars are stopped. Their light is red. The walk sign is on. But you know what? I'm sitting here and I just don't know if there's going to be a car or a huge truck that is flying down the road at 300 miles an hour that's going to plow through these cars, because my cognitive abilities do not allow for me to compute for it, because I don't have all the necessary information to be able to process through this stuff. And so, and even if I did, how can I trust my mind? Because if I can't trust my mind, then how can I make a decision? So I'm going to go ahead and just take this idea of, I have to know, and as being my guide and as being my decision maker. And since I can't know, I'm not going to move. I'm not going to sit here. And even then, if you sit there and decide not to go anywhere, you start to face with this idea of, okay, well, if I sit here, how do I know that nothing's going to come drop from the sky, even though the evidence is that there's nothing there? My point is really this. We live our lives probably, I don't know, I don't want to give a rock solid percentage, but I would say we live the vast majority of our lives making decisions based on insufficient information, based on inductive reasoning. Basically, that we can't know, but based upon experience, we can make inferences. And then we can take those inferences and render a judgment based on those inferences. And then we can act upon that judgment. And we never have to. That's not to say that we never do, but we never have to. And maybe we never do, but we never have to fully close that circle into a working, vicious circle of knowledge using our mind to verify our mind, because it's never really verified. In fact, science works like that. You never actually verify science. At anything, at any point, something, any idea, any law, at any point could be completely hosed by a new piece of information. And that's how we live our lives, so far as I can tell. And so I don't have a problem with this idea of our naturalism coming to this. Well, I do have a problem with the statement, but I don't have a problem with our minds not knowing and our minds not being able to establish a firm foundation of what is actually real. That's my response to that.
So I think the circle actually does close, because you're relying on the cognitive faculties to be reliable deliverers of truth, and as something that you can count on to properly help you form beliefs that comport with the reality around you. But if you start out with this idea of naturalism, you have no justification whatsoever that to be able to support your view that the cognitive faculties are reliable apart from using the cognitive faculties themselves. So it is a vicious circle in terms of, because if you look at evolutionary theory, Stephen, evolutionary theory, supposedly, which I think I find extremely interesting, supposedly the cognitive faculties are not aimed at truth. They're aimed at survival of the species.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah.
Which means that your cognitive faculties are not primarily a mechanism by which you could discover truth, because if believing a lie enhances or increases your probabilities for survival, then based on evolutionary theory, your cognitive faculties will embrace the lie as if it were true, because it enhances your survivability, which I think is utterly ridiculous to think that nature itself actually even cares about your survival. I mean, that's, to me, a non-starter. I don't understand how that would even possibly come into view.
Well, I think
if we're just atoms, if reality is just atoms falling through space, or we're all just molecules in motion, why would it matter if we survive or not?
Yeah, sure. I can completely understand that point of view. At least I can relate to it. I mean, I can empathize with it. I think it's the right word, not necessarily relate to it. But I look at it as, in the sense of whether or not the evolutionary theory was relying on is trying for survivability or trying for knowledge. I would agree that it's necessary, by definition, it's the idea of passing on those genes and the idea of survivability. However, that being said, I think that if you look at the idea of evolutionary theory, and if you look at the way some different organisms and different species survive, they survive by making use of, and they survive and pass on those genes by making use of different tools. Some animals, the cheetah relies on speed. The alligator relies on stealth and strength. You could go down the list. The snake relies on venom and all these types of things. Human beings, probably the biggest tool that we have, so to speak, is our brains, and that is the tool by which we navigate this earth to a point where we can survive and pass on our genes. So when I look at it from the position of, yes, I can agree that the bottom line is survivability. But when I look at it from that position and accept that maybe our knowledge or our body of understanding of the world around us as being the tool to achieve that ability to pass on our genes, it makes a lot more sense to me. And I'm okay with that. And does it make sense? Maybe not. Does it make sense to believe? Does it make sense to believe that we have some grand purpose if everything is just atoms floating around, bouncing around? Maybe not. But I guess to me that assumes that there is some sense to be made of it at all. Maybe that could be an illusion of sense that we use, that our molecules lined up to enable us to grow and survive and pass on our genes. It gets very deep very quick, and I can see why those muddy waters might cause pause in a lot of people. And I think that a big part of me thinks that it's kind of a pride thing too, that people don't want to believe that. Maybe that's another reason that people don't want to believe that, is maybe this idea of not having this ironclad purpose or this ultimate purpose is really unnerving to people. And if that's the reality, that's the reality, and that's the way I look at it. I have purpose, but it's self-defined.
I guess my response to that, Stephen, is that based on naturalism, that explanation really wouldn't fly. It's inconsistent with everything else that naturalism holds, right? The idea that, well, number one, that I don't want to believe something. Well, excuse me, wait a minute. What do you mean I don't want to believe something? My beliefs are not up to me. My beliefs are wired into me. They are forming on their own as natural processes are working in my brain. So
sure. Now I'm just gonna jump in real quick right here, and I think this comes back to the whole idea of heroes versus villains. That that some naturalists might say, if I was going to take that position, what I would probably say to that is that, in the same sense that we are just classifying and labeling a hero or classifying and labeling a villain based on our understanding or based on a certain classification and arrangement of these atoms in the world around us, we can sit here and also say that the idea of I don't want, the idea of I want, the idea of I believe, these could just be particular arrangements of the physical world around us that we, in this position, in this current state, are classifying.
Yeah, see, to me, that's just smuggling in naturalism after the fact, because um, what you're describing in terms of the human experience is not consistent with the basic claim of naturalism. However, when you look at how Christianity would explain this, just by the fact of what Christianity believes about reality, metaphysics, the ontological state of the world, we don't even have to struggle with this. It's not a mystery to us. It's clear. We have easy answers, and they make sense, and they are consistent with our overall worldview. But when I listen to you talk about this, and I think about how I live my life, and I think about how I think and carry on, it's very foreign to my experience. And I think that, there's got to be something in terms of the existential component of this that can serve as a defeater for this type of belief system. So,
as far as, I mean, when I hear that Christianity serves and creates a worldview that makes sense,
that's not what Christianity. That's not what Christianity does, by the way. But
no, I understand. It's a worldview, or the Christian belief is a worldview, and to say that it makes sense and to say that it is consistent, I would agree to the extent that you limit your worldview to, an enclosed space, and basically a closed system. I think that there are things that the Christian worldview does not get right, and that are not consistent with, reality as science has come to realize it.
So let's go back to something you said a few minutes ago about that
Sure.
circle not closing.
Sure.
If that circle doesn't close in your worldview, and there are discoveries out there that that could really be a game changer,
Sure.
then isn't it always possible that next year a scientist makes a discovery that is a game changer, that all of a sudden now all these interpretations of data that seemed to go against Christianity because of how they're interpreted have to be reinterpreted, and those reinterpretations actually force them to align perfectly with the Christian worldview? So isn't that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know why that wouldn't be possible.
So let me ask you,
that being said, you could say the exact same thing about Hinduism. You could say the same thing about Islam, or
no, you can't.
You can, though. I mean,
you really. I hear this all the time from atheists, and you really can't.
Why not?
Hinduism, in and of itself, is a contradictory system. You can believe anything you want to believe in Hinduism. You can be an atheist or not. You can. I mean, Hinduism, it just allows
which to me seems like it makes it infinitely more consistent than Christianity.
Well, then what happens to rationality in that system? Contradiction disappears, and if that happens, we can't even have a conversation.
Well, obviously, if you're going to have talk about contradictions, then that's one part of it. But like you said, though, and I don't know how you can say that it has to be true for Christianity, but can't be true for another one, for any other religion, for any other belief system, for that matter. Because maybe what appears to be a contradictory statement in the worldview of Hinduism, based on our limited scope and limited body of knowledge, all of a sudden some input or some piece of information that was not there before gets discovered, which opens up an entire new realm of information, which therefore makes that not a contradiction and makes it fit. So, I mean, what?
Well, see, Christianity doesn't share your view that that's possible.
No, I don't. To be completely blunt, I don't really care. I mean, in the end, I care about what is true, and if something is, and if a belief system says that what it says is true, and what is good for it is not good for everything else, I really don't care.
Well,
that doesn't sway me at all.
But if you care about rationality, I think you care.
And I care about rationality, but that doesn't. I don't think Christianity serves me there.
You can't stand in these other religions' shoes and end up with rationality. You end up with irrationalism in those other religions, because you have to toss out the laws of logic. And once you do that, you can forget about anybody being right or wrong about anything. You just may as well just go on and live your life and don't even bother talking about truth, because you could never, ever get to it.
Well, I think that the concept of walking on water violates laws of logic. I mean, the concept
No, it doesn't. It doesn't violate the laws of logic.
Sure, it does. I think that.
What law of logic does it violate?
I think we'd have to break it down, but I think that if you're getting down into the whole idea of, first it breaks laws of physics. And if it breaks laws on physics, I think that you can break it down to where it starts to breaking laws of logic. I think because physics, in the end, I think are based on laws of logic. I think laws of logic are kind of the foundation from which all these viewpoints are formed. So if you can determine, that, any scientific hypothesis breaks a law of logic or breaks a law of physics, then at some point it's also breaking a law of logic, because that's what physics is ultimately based on.
I don't agree.
Well, I mean that's okay, but I'd have to sit down.
Laws of logic are non-material or abstract thoughts. They have nothing to do with physical objects or the physical universe. They have to do with propositions.
Sure. Yes, that's true. However, the way we interpret the physical world is based on, and how we navigate it is based on using those laws of logic. So while you can't sit here and say, I can build a house physically on the law of non-contradiction, you can use the law of non-contradiction as a baseline law to build a house. Does that make sense? Like a brick is a brick, right? A brick isn't a brick and not a brick at the same time, right?
That's a proposition. It has nothing to do with brickness.
Okay, sure, but I mean, it's a description of the law of non-contradiction. Like
you might not be able to communicate, right? Eventually you get to a position where your workers can't build a house because they can't communicate with each other if you do away with the laws of logic.
Exactly.
But
that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
But some of your atheist compadres actually are doing this. They are so desperate to reject God that they're saying really silly things about logic.
Like
what?
Like
logic is not necessary truth. That's for starters. Logic is contingent. Give me a break. Everything crumbles if you say logic is contingent. Now I can ignore the law of non-contradiction. We don't have anything to talk about anymore.
No, I completely agree with that. I personally have not heard.
Oh, I've been slammed on Twitter.
I'm not saying. Well, okay. Well, let's be honest here. And I'm an atheist not because I like those guys, or because I think they're smart, or because I think I want to be part of their group. I'm by my nature, I just kind of go my own path, and this is my own path, and I have my own reasons for being here. So, and let's be very blunt. Just because you're an atheist doesn't necessarily mean you're smart. It doesn't necessarily mean you're intelligent in any way, shape, or form. But that being said, just because you're a Christian doesn't make you intelligent either. You can find people in both parks who are incredibly intelligent, people in both parks who are incredibly not. I'm not going to sit here and say that I am incredibly intelligent. I would like to think that I am not incredibly dumb, but so if they say that, I completely agree with you. That's ridiculous. And the conversation it's a non-starter. Again, because I think that's our foundation. I think that's where we start. And if I had to concede to you anything, and I think that this is kind of what I'm getting at ultimately, is that because our minds, and this is kind of my logical breakdown of this, okay, of the way I think. Based on my understanding, my mind is physical. And if my mind is physical, it is of a finite size. And if I have a finite sized brain, in order for me to have an infinite amount of knowledge, I believe that I would have to have an infinitely sized brain, because I would have to have the neurological power to be able to compute and process every bit of knowledge, every bit of information that is out there. Since I don't, so far as I don't know, for example, where your house is. I don't know what street you live on. I don't know how many trees you have in your front yard, if you have any at all. So I have a limited sized brain that is capable of housing a limited size amount of knowledge. And because of that, I can also sit here and acknowledge to you exactly what you said to me earlier, that just like with Christianity, any one of my beliefs could be wrong, even no matter how rock solid I believe them, because at some point in the future, that body, that expanse of knowledge might get a little bit bigger and allow a little piece of information or a big piece of information into my head that forms a bridge that results in a bunch of rewiring and reconnection that ultimately results in the conclusion that one of the things that I thought was true is actually false. And, conversely, something that I thought was false could actually be true, like we were talking about with Christianity. So, because of that, because there's always the room for more knowledge, there's always the room for some piece of knowledge coming in here and basically turning my world upside down as far as what I know and don't know, I cannot sit here and say to you with any reasonableness or any degree of reason that I know anything with 100% certainty. So, at some point, you can sit here and say, and you can sit here and argue, and I think that I've heard your side. I kind of lump you in. I don't know if you're going to take this as an insult or a compliment, but I kind of lump you in with the likes of like Zeitenbruggenkate or Zeitenbruggenkate. I don't know how you say his name, but where was I going with this? My body of knowledge is limited, so I don't know anything with 100% certainty. Anything. And as a result of that, I have to rely on some basal, yes, this is where I was going with it. I have to rely on some ultimate, if you want to call it, logical fallacy. I have to. I have no choice. That logical fallacy, I guess you could say, is to assume that something is true without evidence. And maybe it's just a one-time situation, which I happen to believe. I happen to believe that it's a one-time situation back when you're basically first out of the womb, maybe even before. You are forced to acknowledge or accept something as true without having any justification for it. And maybe at that point, what you're saying is true. Maybe it's an infinite circle or a gnarly circle or a, you know, what is that term that you use for it? A vicious circle, to sit here and say, my mind has to confirm something and it has nothing to rely on it, but it's mine. So you're talking in circles. But if I can acknowledge to you that at some point I have to create or commit some logical fallacy, I think that we all do. And if that's the case, my objective isn't necessarily to be perfect. I think that Christians can come to understand something like this, but it's to be as close to it as possible. So in terms of being logical, my goal is to commit as few logical fallacies as possible, not necessarily to commit none, right? Just like the Christian worldview is not necessarily to be sinless, because the idea is that nobody can be sinless. It's just to be as sinless as possible. And that's kind of my worldview. I guess the logical fallacies are my idea of sin.
Well, all right. So I'm getting the yanks. So I want to button this up.
Sure.
And would like, one of the things that I'm kicking around with the guys as we're starting to get this podcast up and going is potentially on a regular basis having a Christian and let's just say non-Christian, who knows where it could go, but maybe agnostic, atheism, like a roundtable. If I could get a few guys who are Christians, a few guys who are atheists or agnostics, to get together once a month or once every 2 months and do this and just have a civil, respectful, polite conversation around what they believe. I think that there's probably a lot of people out there in the internet world who might actually find a conversation amongst people with those kinds of views, treating each other civilly and just exchanging ideas and having a little argument and debate. They might find that stimulating. They might find it useful. So put that in the back of your mind. Think about that. We're just getting started with the podcast, and so we're going to be doing probably a lot of internal Christian debates too, because one of my criticisms, you were talking about Christians being intelligent. One of my criticisms of Christianity is that we do not have a lot of people who they're just not using their minds the way that they should, and they could do much better. So,
well, I don't even have to sit here and think about it. I can tell you right now, I'd absolutely be interested, especially based on my experience with you today. I mean, it's been, in my mind, it's been incredibly civil. It's been a lot of fun. It's been very interesting for sure.
Yep.
So,
well, we absolutely, I appreciate that. So, it's you're right in terms of, I come from the same school of thought in terms of apologetics that Sai comes from, but my style and my approach is probably going to be, I'm not going to say wildly different in a better way or a worse way, or it's just going to be wildly different, because I personally think that I don't want to fight with people over these issues. I want to have conversations with people about these issues, meaningful conversations where we're stimulating one another's intellect. And, as a Christian, I hope that maybe somebody will change their mind. And you probably, as, someone who is not a Christian, you may just say, look, maybe somebody will learn better, or maybe somebody will be persuaded by what I say. And, I'm perfectly fine with that. But I think it would be a lot of fun. And I think a lot of people would find it very useful. And maybe we can do something different. Because what I see out there right now is an awful lot of fighting and nastiness and people being rude to each other and people shutting each other down in conversations. And to me, that's just not cool. I don't.
No, it's not cool. And I will not sit here and say I'm above it. I've participated in it before. I try not to, but if we have, I typically respond in kind. So if we have a situation, a discussion like we had today, it'd be fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
Awesome. Well, listen, it's late out here, and you probably are thinking about dinner as I look at the clock out there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to let you go, and I'll reach out to you on Twitter, and we'll line this up again.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks for the talk. You have a good evening.
All right. You too, Stephen. See you later.
All right. Bye-bye.